Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Madeline Nicholson, and I am a program officer at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to our members in attendance. Your support is critical to our work. If you are not a member, please consider joining. We have a wide range of levels for you to choose from. The Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform. Views expressed by individuals are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Please silence your phones, but not your voices. This event is on the record. We are live streaming, and we welcome your social media engagement. Later, we will be taking audience Q&A from the room and online at chi.cnf.io. Our moderator today is Matt Abbott, the Council's Director of Government and Diplomatic Programs. He previously served as a staff member in the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives. Matt has also been awarded fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, Pacific Forum CSIS, and the South Korean Ministry of Unification. He completed his undergraduate work at Dartmouth and his graduate work at the University of Chicago. Our speaker, Josh Keating, is a staff writer and editor at Slate, focusing on international news, U.S. foreign policy, and the intersection of politics and social science. Previously, he was a writer and editor at Foreign Policy. Josh is a graduate of Oberlin College. His new book, Invisible Countries, Journeys to the Edge of Nationhood, explores border changes, the creation of new countries, and the future of the world map. It will be available for sale and signing after the program from our partners, The Bookseller. Please join me in welcoming Josh Keating and Matt Abbott.
Great. Well, Madeline, thank you so much for that warm introduction. And Josh, thank you for joining us at the Council. Welcome to Chicago. Before we get started with the discussion, I know you wanted to read a brief passage from your book, so I wanted to give you the opportunity to do so.
Thank you. Thanks for hosting me here. I'm just going to read a few pages right from the beginning of the book, just to give you kind of an idea of the topic and the tone of it. It was close to dusk on the Black Sea coast when the parade of imaginary countries began. On the surface, it was an event not unlike the opening ceremonies of any other international sporting event. Sequined divas belted cheesy inspirational pop ballads. Choreographed masses of dancers performed a tribute to the glorious history of the host nation. Athletes, most with little hope of making it past the early rounds of competition, mugged for selfies and proudly waved their flags. But the 12 teams that had made the journey to the World Football Cup in Abkhazia in June 2016 were representing countries that are not at all like the countries at the Olympics or the World Cup. And none of the flags paraded through the stadium that night are on display outside UN headquarters in New York City. These were countries that most people don't consider countries at all. The World Football Cup, organized by the Confederation of Independent Football Associations, is where countries compete when they don't meet the threshold of statehood required for membership in bodies like FIFA, the International Olympic Committee, or for that matter, the UN General Assembly. Some were the type of places that are described in news reports by dismissive phrases like breakaway, semi-autonomous, or self-proclaimed. The host country, Abkhazia, was one such, de facto independent since breaking off from newly independent Georgia in a devastating civil war that ended in 1993, but today recognized by only Russia and 3 other countries. As far as the United States and Europe were concerned, this event was being held in Georgia. A team represented the Kurds, the largest ethnic group in the world without its own state, but one that is now tantalizingly close to achieving the dream of independence. Somaliland, an unlikely and unrecognized beacon of stability in the Horn of Africa, was also represented, as was northern Cyprus, the Turkish-dominated northern half of the Mediterranean island. Some teams represented groups wronged by history. The Western Armenia contingent represented a Turkish-Armenian community decimated during World War I. The Chagos Islanders, originally from a small archipelago in the Indian Ocean, but now living largely in the Crawley area of London, were evicted from their home islands by the British government in 1971 when the United States built a military base on Diego Garcia. Other teams represented ethnic minorities who found themselves on the wrong side of international borders, such as the Koreans of Japan or the Hungarians of Romania. A Punjabi team purported to represent not only the historical region today divided between the countries of India and Pakistan, but a global Punjabi diaspora. A Sami team represented an indigenous group living in northern Scandinavia that has achieved a significant level of political autonomy in recent years. Rounding out the competition were some European regions, Padania, or northern Italy, and Raetia, the Romansh-speaking region of Switzerland, that seemed less interested in making a political statement than in just playing some football. Only the hardiest fans of esoteric international soccer made the long trip to Abkhazia to watch the tournament, but a fair number of foreign reporters were in attendance, attracted by the quirky spectacle of a World Cup for countries that don't exist. The event was also a blatant propaganda exercise for the host government. Abkhazia is a place that doesn't rate highly for news coverage, even compared to other participants in the frozen conflicts of the post-Soviet world. It was easy to be skeptical about the event and of Konifa, an Isle of Man-based body staffed by a skeleton crew of volunteers, but I came to appreciate the open-minded approach to nationhood taken by the event. Konifa currently has 47 members, and no, you can't just declare your local pub an independent nation and start a football team. New members are decided on by a vote of the existing membership and generally have to be semi-autonomous states or minority groups recognized by international NGOs. Still, a few members, such as Cascadia, a region of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, seemed a little dubious to me. More than any other activity except perhaps war, for which they often serve as a metaphor, sports can bring the world's countries into contact with each other. You don't have to buy the kumbaya platitudes of organizations like FIFA and the IOC to acknowledge that the appreciation of athletic competition, particularly the world's most popular sport, has a rare ability to cut across national boundaries, even as it incites national pride. Because a national team is often seen as the proxy for a country's ambitions on the world stage, events like the World Cup and the Olympics serve to reinforce the international community's narrow definition of national legitimacy. Only real countries need apply. But whatever your views on the current borders of the Caucasus, Central Europe, or the Middle East, Konifa's more open-minded approach is refreshing, an acknowledgement that the countries start out as a dream before they can become acknowledged reality. Nations have been referred to as imagined communities for good reason. What countries aren't self-proclaimed, after all? There was also something undeniably poignant in the alternate history of the world that the event displayed. If a few battles, peace conferences, and revolutions had turned out differently, it's not impossible to imagine an alternate historical timeline in which Punjab, Padania, and Kurdistan are established countries with seats on the United Nations and teams in the Olympics, while Pakistan, Italy, and Iraq are merely the fanciful notions of dreamers and fanatics. The event was a useful reminder that the map of the world we all know today is the product of a series of accidents and historical processes that could easily have gone another way.
Great, thank you very much. Just getting started, can you tell us a little bit more about what got you interested in this topic and why you wanted to write this book?
Sure. I mean, I've always been sort of obsessive about maps ever since I was a kid, and some of my sort of earliest political memories are the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union, and it always kind of fascinated me, this idea that one country could split into two, or one country two countries could rejoin into one, or one could split apart into 15. And I had this idea that the world map was something fluid, and an atlas you bought one year could be out of date a couple of years later. But by the time I started doing this professionally, when I wrote about international politics, that really wasn't the case anymore. The world map had become pretty static, and the creation of new countries was kind of the exception to the rule. There were a few, South Sudan, East Timor, but it really doesn't happen that often anymore. And I was interested in exploring why that was in these sort of unrecognized countries, places that sort of got half the way there, were always something that interested me. And it was sort of a niche interest, I'd say, until about 2014, when a couple things happened. One was the annexation of Crimea. One was the emergence of ISIS, which challenged the established borders in the Middle East. And one was, and we started to see coverage of China building artificial islands in the South China Sea as a way of expanding its territorial claims. So all of a sudden, this topic of sovereignty and borders and the sort of fluid control of territory was very much back in the headlines, and it seemed like a good time to explore it in more depth.
Absolutely. And before we talk about some of the case studies in your book, I just wanted to touch briefly on semantics. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is a nation, what is a state, and what is a country?
Sure. Well, a state is generally more of a political or legal entity, and there is actually a definition under international law, which holds that a state is the entity that that has a government a defined borders, a permanent population, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. That's in a treaty called the Montevideo Convention, which I heard a lot about in all the places I visited. Now, of course, there are places that don't meet those criteria that we do recognize as states, and there are places that do meet them that we don't recognize, so it's a little fluid. A nation is generally a sort of a cultural community or affinity group that seeks political self-determination. So it's not, just a sort of purely anthropological community. It's one that sort of seeks political self-determination, which in our modern world basically means that it seeks to have its own state or get as close to it as possible. A lot of, we tend to sort of use the term nation-state for like the combination of these two ideas, but most sort of existing states in the world aren't just sort of one cultural group. They most have sizable minority populations, or there's members of that community living outside its borders. So these can be a little complicated. And I just sort of chose the word country, for one, because it's sort of the most generic term. It can encompass several different types of entities. And two, because I wanted to get to this idea that it's a piece of land, which I think is what a country connotes, that it's a specific physical territory on the map of the world. And then that's really what I was sort of interested in looking at.
Sure. And for your research, you traveled quite extensively in these semi-autonomous countries, places like Abkhazia, Iraqi Kurdistan, Somaliland. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the people and personalities that you met during your travels?
Sure. I mean, the soccer tournament that I was just talking about was something that I actually found out about after I'd already started research on the book, and it just seems like sort of a perfect opportunity to sort of create a framing device to find a place where all these countries were sort of gathered together, and these are places that don't have a lot in common other than their kind of unrecognized political status. So it was interesting to me that there was a kind of community for them at this event. And while I was there, I wrote a magazine article for a website called Roads and Kingdoms, and I followed the Somaliland national soccer team. And after that, when I visited Somaliland, those guys became a kind of great guide for me, and pretty good friends. And so that was a place where I did have the opportunity, I'd say more so than the others, to actually kind of find a bit of a community in the place that I visited. When I visited Kurdistan, it was the war against ISIS was still very much, the battle against Mosul was sort of raging just a few miles away. So that was a very interesting time to visit. And there was a massive influx of refugees from both neighboring Syria and internally displaced people from other parts of Iraq. So I spent a lot of my time in the refugee camps there, sort of meeting people who'd found themselves in Kurdistan, sometimes not out of choice. The two other places I visited, one was Akwesasne, which is a Mohawk community that straddles the US-Canada border. It's basically where New York State, Ontario, and Quebec all meet each other. And there I spent some time with the local government. There are actually 3 local governments. There's one recognized by Canada, one by the US, and one a sort of traditional tribal government. And the Canadian recognized chief of Akwesasne was the person who's, I think, sort of most receptive to my project for whatever reason, and he was a good guide. And then the final place I visited was Kiribati, which is a small island country in the Central Pacific. It's spelled like Kiribati, in case you've seen it. But there what I was interested in was the impact of climate change. Kiribati is a fully recognized country with a seat at the United Nations, and there's sort of no dispute about that, but it's a place that, because of rising sea levels, there's an increasing chance that the population of Kiribati may have to completely relocate in the coming decades. And the challenge they're faced with is if there's a way to kind of maintain their nationality and their political sovereignty, if the kind of physical spot on the map they occupied is no longer inhabitable. And that's something that I think the world's only starting to come to grips with.
Touching on that, with climate change and the threat to these island nations of their landmass potentially no longer existing, what happens to a country if its landmass is overtaken by water and it no longer exists?
Yeah, well, it's a kind of new, there's not really a precedent for it. I mean, there are certainly plenty of countries that used to exist that no longer do, but that space on the map is occupied by some new country, and the people who lived there before still live there, just under a new government. What we've never really dealt with is the actual, physical disappearance of the territory, and this is something that international law doesn't really have a mechanism for dealing with. And to be honest, the sort of leaders of Kiribati have only started to deal with it. The previous president, Anote Tong, got a lot of publicity for purchasing some land in Fiji with the idea that this was a place that at least some of the population of Kiribati could relocate to. The thing is, most people in Kiribati don't believe that that's something they're actually going to do. They are in many ways sort of as in denial about the coming impacts of climate change as the rest of us are, even though they're to a much greater extent on the front lines of it. A lot of time, there's some legal scholars that are sort of dusting off kind of older examples of sovereignty. The idea that a country had to be this fixed, or a state had to be this sort of fixed piece of land on the map with a permanent population is relatively new. I mean, there was a time that sovereignty was more embedded in the person of a ruler, and territory that was something that could be traded between nations. And so I think that if we do face these challenges, and if these countries are trying to sort of maintain some level of political sovereignty that can both represent them on an international level and give them, some control over the natural resources that are in their maritime territory, then it's going to kind of require some more flexible thinking about what a country is.
Some of the semi-autonomous countries that you visited, like Somaliland and Iraqi Kurdistan, in recent years have maintained a much greater level of security than the countries of which they are technically a part. How is this possible?
Yeah, well, it's kind of become the basis of their sovereignty, or the basis of their claim, I should say, for nationality. They say, look at us. We have this is a peaceful territory. It's more democratic than its neighbors. It's more stable, more prosperous. And then this kind of becomes the case they make to the international community for why they should be recognized as independent. It hasn't really worked in either case. I think the international community is sort of invested in maintaining these larger states as kind of integral units. But often I think in both Somaliland and Kurdistan's case, I think that being culturally homogenous has been a kind of advantage to stability. There hasn't been much sort of internal friction, and in the case of Kurdistan, obviously they've had the most significant factor is probably the backing of the U.S. and especially since the first Gulf War, there's been the U.S.-led coalition has helped sort of protect them first under Saddam, and then there's been significant military aid since the second Iraq War. But that support has its limits. The U.S. has been a friend to Kurdistan over the years, but that friendship always stops just short of support for independence.
Staying on the topic of security, are there any concerns or examples of terrorist groups or criminal groups using these states' unique political circumstances for nefarious purposes? And on that note, how do international law enforcement bodies operate within these unique jurisdictions?
Well, it's interesting to look at Akwesasne, which is a place that is sort of both in the U.S. and Canada, but not really in either of them. And it is a place where the kind of ambiguous jurisdiction has made it particularly appealing to smugglers. I mean, the town has a particularly bad name in the Canadian press as a kind of transshipment point for drugs. Until recently, for refugees coming into the U.S. I'm not sure it may be going the other way now. But so that kind of jurisdictional ambiguity does create opportunities for criminals, for terrorists, for for people trying to skirt the law. And there are other examples of that. I mean, Transnistria, the breakaway region of Moldova, is kind of notorious for this as a smuggling kind of smuggler's paradise. But there are counterexamples as well. I mean, Somaliland has been much more effective at combating piracy than a lot of the areas surrounding it. And actually, often when the kind of international coalition fighting pirates in the Gulf of Aden has captured them off the Somali coast, they're often transferred to Somaliland for imprisonment. So that's a kind of counterexample where one of these places actually sort of does a better job.
Are there any heightened risks for travelers to these non-recognized countries, given that lack of international recognition?
It's certainly, you get when, the hardest part is almost finding information, because there's sort of the State Department warning lists that don't recognize these as independent countries. And so if you're traveling to Somaliland, you get warned in very strong terms not to travel to Somalia. But in all these cases, I'd say, in the Somaliland and the Kurdish case, they're fairly safe places to travel. They're not particularly difficult to travel to. They're regular flights. Things are fairly safe compared to the surrounding regions, which is an admittedly low bar. But then again, these are places where it can be difficult to access consular services. For instance, if you do get into trouble, it's not somewhere you want to lose your passport. That was actually a big concern at the soccer tournament in Abkhazia. There was a fan who lost his British passport, I believe, and wound up getting a phone call from the British embassy in Tbilisi, in the capital of Georgia, and sort of very annoyed because they advised people not to travel to these areas. So, there's certainly risks. I'd say there's sort of, they're not sort of immediately dangerous, when as you would think they are, hearing Iraq and Somalia. But they're definitely sort of increased risk factors you have to be aware of, mostly in terms of kind of access to your home government that may not recognize those places as independent or particularly want you to go there.
Sure. And now looking at travel for citizens of certain countries, or semi-autonomous countries like Iraqi Kurdistan, Somaliland, how did the Trump administration's travel ban on Iraq, Somalia impact citizens of those semi-autonomous places?
Yeah, well, they have a difficult time traveling to begin with. If you're trying to travel on the passport of an unrecognized country, often that's not going to be recognized anywhere. So a lot of them Kurds have Iraqi passports usually, and some Somalilanders have Somali passports, but there are places that will sort of accept them even if they're not supposed to. The Somaliland was covered under, and actually in the initial version of the ban, which covered Iraq, that applied to Kurds as well. And it was interesting, the foreign minister of Somaliland, who I spoke with, was asked about the travel ban after it came into effect. And you might expect him to say, no, this is this blatantly discriminatory thing that's just Islamophobic, and we're absolutely opposed to it. But actually what he said, I believe in an interview with NPR, was, oh, this makes sense, but we shouldn't be included in that. That should just apply to Somalia. Like, they're the ones who you need to worry about. So that kind of tells you all you need to know about Somaliland's attitude towards its neighbor.
One of the problems that these semi-autonomous countries face is economic exclusion. How do they trade internationally?
Yeah, well, it's funny, they all kind of point to Taiwan as the kind of gold standard. It's a country that can, develop as a, prosperous democracy despite, most countries in the world not recognizing it. Taiwan, of course, had the advantage of having been recognized until, and sort of being partly so now. But it is an obstacle for attracting international investment. I spoke to the energy minister in Somaliland about this, about how it's their sort of companies just don't want to set up, investment there. It's, one, because Somalia has a bad name, and two, because of this sort of ambiguous sovereignty issues. They have had a little more success. I mean, there's a kind of ongoing project to redevelop the port in Somalia that's a Dubai Ports World. The UAE-based company has taken on. There's some exploratory oil drilling by international firms, which hasn't really found much so far off the coast. But it is a major obstacle to investment. And obviously, sort of control of petroleum resources is maybe, the key point of contention in Kurdistan's efforts to increase its autonomy from Iraq and to gain control over the more regions of Iraqi territory.
Absolutely. From what you saw during your travels and research, are there any advantages to being one of these invisible countries?
Yeah, well, it's I'd say in the Somaliland case, I think that there are some people you meet there who think that it has been to their advantage to have to kind of make it on their own. They have not received as much foreign aid as other countries. They have not received as much investment, and they have sort of built institutions there. And I don't want to overstate the case. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, but it's they have kind of had to do it on their own, and I think that. They may be, in some ways, in a slightly stronger position if they do eventually gain recognition than some places that were more kind of fully dependent on foreign aid and international support right off the bat. And you could point to South Sudan as an example of that, of a country that was never really kind of ready to stand on its own 2 feet.
Absolutely. Of these semi-autonomous countries you studied, which one do you feel has the best chance of getting full autonomy, and why?
I'm not sure any of them do, to be honest. I mean, I would have said Kurdistan until actually after I'd completed the manuscript of the book. They held a referendum last fall, and not surprisingly, Kurds overwhelmingly supported independence, but Baghdad did not recognize the results of the referendum. None of their neighbors supported them and actually helped blockade the territory. A lot of the cities they had gained during the fighting against ISIS were lost again to the Iraqi government control. And they've kind of found themselves on the margins again. They're with sort of less autonomy and less territory than they had before. Somaliland's a case where I just don't think there's much incentive. Not much of the international community sees much incentive to grant them independence. I mean, there are a few other places you can point to that I don't write about. In a few weeks, New Caledonia, which is a French territory in the Pacific, is going to hold a referendum on independence, which is probably not going to pass, but it's sort of within the realm of possibility. So, I don't want to say that there's no prospects for changing the world map, but I'd say it's becoming, I'm sort of even more convinced than I was when I started the book that it's extraordinarily difficult to gain independence these days.
On that note, the Trump administration has shown a willingness to disrupt traditional diplomatic norms. Do you see any chance that the Trump administration might recognize some of these countries that don't currently have U.S. recognition?
Yeah, well, I'd say that, I talk about this kind of age of stasis we live in, and one of the reasons for that is that the U.S. has traditionally not been in favor of either secessionist movements or border changes, and there are some exceptions to that, like Kosovo and South Sudan, but it generally holds good dating back to the Cold War when you look at Biafra or Bangladesh. But the Trump administration has shown a bit of a different approach to this. I mean, there was, during the transition period, the president kind of flirted with the idea of overturning the one China policy and maybe recognizing Taiwan. There was obviously the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, which kind of upset the regional status quo that was going to be left unsettled for now. In more recent weeks, there's this proposal on the table, sort of trade territory between Kosovo and Serbia in order for both of them to join the EU. This would involve a sort of heavily Serb area of Kosovo going to Serbia in exchange for heavily Albanian area going to Kosovo. And while most European governments have been very wary about this idea for fear of the precedent that it would set, that it would just embolden nationalists and lead to more conflict, John Bolton actually said, if this is something that can work out, then we're not going to stand in the way of it. And so I kind of think that they are kind of less attached to the idea of maintaining these borders as they exist than maybe some of their predecessors were. Then again, they didn't come to the Kurds' help after the referendum. And I honestly just don't think most of these places are on their radar to the same extent I doubt they're going to be weighing in too much on the places in my book, but certainly in Taiwan or in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where places that are sort of much more on the agenda, I could see the potential for kind of more radical breaks in precedent.
Sure. Going back to Kosovo, did U.S. support for Kosovo's independence from Serbia have any impact on Russia's support for places like Abkhazia or Transnistria?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every kind of conversation I had with an official in Abkhazia eventually turned into a conversation about Kosovo. They, point to this as a, just blatant hypocrisy from their point of view. Like, why does the U.S. back Kosovo when Abkhazia's claim for independence is just as valid? And it was, I think, the formal recognition, which came after the 2008 Georgia War, was a kind of tit-for-tat response. I think it was, if you're going to recognize this country, we're going to recognize our people. And you can see it in sort of the countries that lined up behind them. It's, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and actually in the last few months, Syria have all backed or have all established diplomatic relations with Abkhazia and with South Ossetia. And this is, these are obviously countries that are trying to find a way to sort of stand up to U.S. pressure and improve their standing with Moscow.
And you mentioned in your book about the Age of Stasis in terms of the creation of new countries. And you mentioned that this is due in part to the U.S. being a backer of the geographical status quo. If the U.S. pursues this policy of America first and retreats from that global leadership role, do you envision that this could change over time and the opportunity for more countries being created could actually appear?
I think it could, yeah. I mean, it's not only the U.S. I'd say, the multilateral institutions that, when we talk about the liberal world order, and if you look at the EU or the UN or the African Union, they all have kind of built-in biases and, in some cases explicitly stated in their charters, discouraging the adjustment of borders. So that exists. It's going to be interesting to see how China comes down on this issue. Obviously territorial issues are a major concern for them. There's not just Taiwan, but their efforts to kind of assert sovereignty over, or assert their kind of dominance over Hong Kong and sort of tamp down on separatism in Xinjiang and in Tibet. So they're kind of anti-separatist to a fault. And so you'd expect them to kind of uphold the status quo on this. But, then again, as I mentioned earlier, you see this sort of island building in the South China Sea and these kind of efforts to, maintain a sphere of influence. So and express it in a very formal way. So there, I think you do see some differences from the U.S. approach. And I think it's less clear how they're going to come down on it. Russia obviously seems to have very little attachment to the geographical status quo and will kind of, where these ambiguities exist in places like Crimea, where where they kind of have the opportunity to make territorial gains and those opportunities present themselves, they're going to do that.
You also mentioned in your book that for decades there have been predictions that territorial divisions would wither away due to globalization. Why hasn't this actually happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think even when I started the book, I had this idea like, okay, maybe borders aren't shifting, maybe we're like stuck with the map we have, but maybe it won't matter so much. Maybe with economic globalization and the internet and increased migration, I mean, it's not going to matter that much what country you live in anyway, because we're all going to be, global citizens. I think the last couple of years have definitely not been kind to that way of thinking. We've seen a resurgence of nationalism and nativism, obviously in this country, also in Europe, and a sort of rise of both governments and sort of populist political movements that have a strong emphasis on, traditional notions of sovereignty and strong borders and controls on immigration. And so I think, a lot of those factors that we pointed to, there has been a kind of backlash to it. And I think that a lot of the disruptions caused by globalization, populations have responded to them by a kind of re-embrace of these sort of older forms of nationalism.
One question before we turn to audience questions. What does citizenship entail in these semi-autonomous countries? And does it differ from what citizenship entails in a fully autonomous country?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's, they I think see it the same way we do. I mean, it's, they have the same sort of strong, both sentimental and political attachment to their governments that all of us who live in recognized countries do. I think obviously sometimes it's stronger in that it's something that they have to kind of continuously reinforce whenever sort of presenting themselves to the outside world. They have to constantly be making the case for who they are. I mean, I met an incredible woman in Somaliland, Edna Adan, who runs a sort of former foreign minister, but also a trained OBGYN who runs a maternity hospital in the city of Hargeisa, and she's probably the most famous Somalilander in the world, and she has these sort of business cards that have an arrow pointing to Somaliland on the map, and that she hands out whenever she's at global conferences. So I think that sometimes the need to sort of constantly explain your national identity and make the case for it can definitely make some of those identities even stronger.
Absolutely. Now we'll turn to some audience questions. As a reminder to our live stream audience, if you have a question, please feel free to ask it at chi.cnf.io. And for our in-person audience, if you have a question, please raise your arm. And once I've acknowledged you, a member of our staff will bring a microphone to you. Yes, sir. And a microphone's on its way, sir.
I wonder if our guests can comment on the effect of language and nationhood in territory. For instance, Hitler's rationale for invading Czechoslovakia, Sudetenland was German-speaking, Russia and Eastern Ukraine, Russia, the Russian part of Estonia, 20% speak Russian.
Yeah, and more recently it was the Russian rationale for the annexation of Crimea too. It was a predominantly Russian-speaking area, and that's kind of the justification that's used for why this should sort of naturally be part of Russia. That's sort of definitely one of the factors that nationhood can be built on. I think what I found as I traveled around was that, that there are sort of commonalities for how nations imagine themselves or construct themselves, or how national identity emerges. But, the sort of basic building blocks vary from place to place. I mean, often they're, Somaliland, they speak basically the same language as the rest of Somalia. They have the same religion. To the outside, it seems kind of culturally indistinguishable, but they have this sort of political history of being separate. You could look at, the Korean Peninsula right now. That's a place where I'd say that sort of the longer that border exists and the longer they live in political realities, I think those become cultural differences. And I've even read some articles about how the languages in both countries have transformed, and how there are now sort of significant differences between Korean as it's spoken in North Korea and South Korea. That's certainly the case in Kurdistan as well. There are cultural and dialect differences between Kurds in Iraq and Syria and Turkey and Iran. And so I'd say just as language can be a kind of basis for nationhood, that these kind of political borders, as artificial as we might think they are, can sort of create cultural and even linguistic differences. So it can go both ways, I think.
Turning to a question from our online audience, what role do tech firms and services such as Google Maps have in arbitrating borders and countries as non-state actors?
Yeah, this is kind of a fascinating new frontier for this stuff. I talk a lot in the book about political recognition and how what defines a country is often whether other countries recognize it, but now whether Google recognizes you is another factor. And one factor is a lot of these countries sort of want top-level domain names. So, for instance, being like .uk or .iq if you're in Iraq, it is sort of a marker of status to have one of those two-letter suffixes, and none of the places I went to do have it. When you go to, if you search for Google in Somaliland, it'll take you to Somalia's Google page, and I can imagine that's a kind of constant reminder of how the rest of the world views their sovereignty. I mean, in terms of Google Maps, the companies tried to kind of fudge it. So if you take, they basically recognize the claims of wherever you are. So if you are in the US and you look at Crimea, it'll show it as part of Ukraine. If you're in Russia, it'll show it as part of Russia. So they kind of try to have it both ways.
Very interesting. Yes, ma'am, in the second row. And a microphone is on its way.
Given the number of refugees at this point and the number of essentially displaced persons, many of whom are leaving countries with governments they don't like, do you see more opportunity for these sort of small nationhood, or whatever one calls the indivisible?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a factor I think that hasn't gotten enough attention is the large number of stateless people that this crisis is creating. So there's sort of generations of children being born in camps who are not going to be given citizenship of the, unlike the U.S., most countries don't automatically give you citizenship at birth if you're born within their territory. So, we live in a world where your human and civil rights are more often not tied to, the country's name is on your passport, to, the government you're a citizen of. That's who the basic, entity in charge of protecting your rights or, infringing on them is. I think that a major challenge in the coming years is going to be, how the international community absorbs or doesn't these sort of large populations of people born outside these countries who are stateless.
We'll turn to another question from our online audience. What did researching invisible countries teach you about how recognized countries function and from where they get their legitimacy?
I think just how arbitrary it can be. I mean, I think that you sometimes hear about artificial borders or post-colonial borders being somehow not corresponding to the real cultural realities on the ground. But I don't think there are that many kind of natural countries. I think they're all artificial to some extent or another, and often places that talk about how culturally homogenous they are, they got that way through centuries of border conflict and ethnic cleansing, essentially. So I'd say one, most, the kind of basis of legitimacy for most countries, even the more established ones, are kind of more recent than we think, and often Most lines on the map could easily have gone another way, and we'd be calling those sort of natural and permanent.
Another question from our online audience. What is the importance of having the backing of a major power like the US or Russia for the survival of these places?
It's pretty huge. I mean, I think that, Abkhazia wouldn't exist without Russian support. And if you talk to people there, outside the region, people sort of view it as this Russian puppet state, that it's just essentially Russian-occupied territory in Georgia pretending to be an independent country. And there's some truth to that. On the other hand, I think most Abkhazians sort of genuinely don't want to be part of Russia. They want to be an independent country. That's certainly the sense I got from talking to people there, and they view the sort of Russian military presence as a necessary evil. So some foreign backing is certainly usually required, and it certainly absolutely, there's absolutely no way to become a fully recognized independent country without it. But places like Somaliland show that you can achieve a sort of great deal of de facto autonomy without much backing from the outside world, which is obviously not the same thing as actual recognition.
Another question from our online audience. What surprised you most during the course of your research?
I guess I started out with a kind of this idea that we shouldn't be so attached to borders, and we should sort of allow more territorial changes to take place, and why can't these places just be allowed to become independent? I think over the course of doing the research, I came to understand better why there's reluctance to reopen the topic of borders. I think that there aren't that many examples of peaceful partitions. There aren't that many Czechoslovakias in history, examples like the partition of India or Yugoslavia, where a sort of border change is the prelude to border conflict or genocide even, is sort of a lot more common. So I think I became sort of more sympathetic to the status quo as I researched the book.
Absolutely. And yes, sir, in the back row.
Can you name an unrecognized, independent, wealthy country?
Taiwan would be the example I'd point to. It's recognized by a few places, but it doesn't have formal diplomatic relations with the rest of the world. And interestingly, China has increasingly been trying to pressure other governments the remaining governments that have diplomatic relations with it to cut them off. So, but I'd say that's kind of the most functional unrecognized or semi-recognized state, and the kind of model that a lot of these places aspire to.
And another question from our online audience. What advice would you give to people who are interested in traveling to these unrecognized countries? Find people who've been there before. It's hard to sort of get information through the kind of traditional sources you'd use before you travel. A lot of times they just don't focus on these places for obvious reasons. So I'd say that try to track down somebody who's been there and figure out best practices. And often these places are pretty small, so it's easier than you'd think to get a response from officials if you try to contact them. And yes, sir.
Would the Basque region in Spain fall into your categories here? And what do you see as the political prospects for the future?
Well, I think more so than the Basque region, where I think the movement has died down a bit lately, is Catalonia presents a fascinating case, where another place that just a few weeks after the Kurdish referendum, they held one of their own, and likewise, that one was not recognized by the Spanish government or by any other government in the EU or anywhere else. And so there you have a kind of unprecedented case of a kind of semi or unrecognized state in the heart of democratic, prosperous Western Europe, but that could be another example. Catalonia is the wealthiest part of Spain, and a place that's sort of seeking political autonomy. So, my guess is that those regions aren't going to achieve full political independence. I don't think that there's enough international support for them for that to happen. It'll be interesting to see, how this sort of crisis between Catalonia and the Spanish government resolves itself, and whether they can achieve some greater level of autonomy than they have now. I think it's still kind of up in the air.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. Following the program, Josh's book, Invisible Countries, Journeys to the Edge of Nationhood, will be available for sale and signing by our partner, the bookseller, right by the exit. And please now join me in thanking Josh Keating.
Thank you.